Every photograph that you've ever admired has been edited. Not a single image that's moved you or defined an era or made its way to a gallery wall hasn't gone through some sort of editing process. And in recent years, there's been this weird sort of idea that editing is a disservice to the moment that you photographed. But let me be the first to tell you that that couldn't be farther from the truth. The edit isn't a correction made after the work is done. It's really like the whole work. Editing is where a collection of frames can become a body of vision. I've spent the better part of a decade photographing around the United States, California, Florida, Kentucky, but most predominantly in two cities that couldn't be further apart from one another in the ways that I shot. Number one, Savannah, Georgia, where I completed my first book unveiling Savannah's shadows. Number two, New York City, where over the past 5 years, I've been working on my ongoing book, Souls in an Urban Landscape. Between these two major bodies of work, my relationship to the subject, relationship to light, and relationship to the world around me has changed drastically. But what hasn't changed is my idea that the edit is inseparable from my vision. That the image that you make and the image that you release to the world are two very separate things. And the distance between those two things is what we call craft. And that craft has a much longer history than most photographers realize. Understanding it doesn't just deepen the work, it should help you rethink how you think about these tools. So today I'm going to do something that I never really thought that I would do. And that's kind of take you through the history of editing and my own editing process, the tools that I use, and how you can use them too. Hi, my name is Jared Thomas Tapey. I'm a social documentary photographer and educator here in New York City, and you're watching my YouTube channel. Across my social media channels, I've created 6 segments, each of which pertain to a very distinct aspect of the medium of photography. Crafting a photograph, life through the lens, marks of the maker, the creative connection, tools of the trade, and field notes. Today's video we're taking from my segment, Tools of the Trade. This series is about the brands, experiences, and tools that elevate the artist's journey. Now, if you're not new here, you've definitely heard me say this before, but photography was never a neutral act. From the moment that a human being pointed the camera at the world and made an exposure, the question of how to render that image, of how to translate light into something tangible, was asked. And from the very beginning, the answer to that question was manipulation. Photo manipulation dates all the way back to the 19th century when people were still making photographs on glass and tin. In 1846, Welsh artist Calvert Richard Jones became what may be the first recorded practitioner of photo manipulation when he painted over an unwanted figure in a photograph of Capuchin friars in Malta. By 1860, an unidentified artist had placed Abraham Lincoln's head on the body of South Carolina politician John C. Calhoun, the first composite photograph of record. These were not aberrations. They were kind of more so the opening move to a long-standing tradition. As soon as the artistry and the technology and the chemical processes were available to the general public, artists immediately began experimenting. Discoveries like the wet collodion process, which essentially allowed artists the ability to combine multiple negatives onto one single piece of film. A process like that captivated so many artists dating all the way back to the 1850s. French photographer Gustave Le Gray astonished 19th century audiences with his seascapes by combining separate negatives for sea and sky to overcome the technical limitations of early photographic emulsions, achieving balanced compositions with dramatic skies and reflective waters that would have been impossible in a single exposure. Now, inside the darkroom, photographers had incredible control over their negatives. 2 core techniques, dodging and burning. The tool that's readily available to us in things like Lightroom, Photoshop, VSCO, all of these things came from the printing process. Essentially, allowing the user to manipulate how much light or how much darkness was being added into a specific part of the frame. One of the largest practitioners of this method was Ansel Adams, the 20th century's most celebrated landscape photographer. He was a master of these methods, using burning to darken and dodging to lighten his iconic images of the American West. Jerry Ullsman took it even further, using up to 12 enlargers simultaneously to create dreamlike composite images. His darkroom style allowed him to create images that had realism and that motion of what it seems to be like in a dream. Photographers also used chemicals to bleach or retouch their images before things like Photoshop came about, layering different exposures on a single sheet. The cool part is that not a lot of people know that skin retouching, like we would do in Photoshop today, actually started in the 19th century. Artists would paint directly onto their film and retouch photos. The Surrealists, particularly Man Ray and Hannah Hook, embraced photo montage and darkroom techniques to explore the unconscious, combining fragments of images to create dreamlike compositions that question the very boundaries of reality. Now, I think that understanding the history of the edit is foundational to understanding how we edit today. And that's because the edit didn't arrive with Photoshop. It arrived with photography itself. And sure, the tools have changed, but that impulse hasn't. Now, just like just about every other thing that has to do with photography, the digital age didn't necessarily create editing, but it did democratize it. And in doing so, it really changed photographers' relationships to their images. One of the earliest digital manipulation tools was called SuperPaint. It's a custom-built computer system developed by Richard Shoup in 1972 to 1973. Then, digital manipulation gained a wider traction in the 1980s as more and more people were able to afford computers in their own households. All of that leading to the creation of Adobe Photoshop in 1990. And when that released, it redrew the entire image making process. Things that once required a darkroom to complete were now readily available at the hands of anybody that owned a computer. Now, what's important to know is that at the onset, digital photography was widely disregarded. When the first digital cameras came out, the resolution was poor, they were big and chunky cameras, they were heavy. There were a lot of complaints about battery times. But, of course, as technology improved and the bulk of those cameras went away, the battery life expanded. Now the sensors are some of the strongest sensors in the world. All of that sort of stigma behind shooting digitally went away. And that's important because for the first time in the medium's history, the cost of experimentation was basically zero. You can shoot 1,000 frames and then edit them immediately, all without having to spend a dime on development or film. With the release of the mobile phone, apps like Snapseed, VSCO, and Lightroom Mobile brought in a bunch of sophisticated controls for editing your photos on the go. Sliders for exposure and contrast and clarity and highlights all gave the casual photographer the same sort of controls that would take hours in the darkroom for professional photographers. Meaning that those barriers that were between casual and professional had really separated and fallen away. The question was no longer whether to edit, but how to do it with intention. And herein lies the direct problem with the way that we view editing in today's world. Photoshop didn't create manipulation. It simply made it visible, accessible, and easier for the everyday photographer to use. But with access comes responsibility. The same tools that allow a photographer to develop a singular, coherent visual language also allow for the wholesale fabrication of images that the public has come to distrust. The most important distinction between editing in the history of photography is not analog or digital, but rather the edit as artistic vision and the edit as deception. Understanding those differences is not like an ethical nicety. It's actually more so the foundation of the photographer's craft. I spent 4 years making the photos that would eventually become my first book, Unveiling Savannah Shadows. A project that began with a connection between myself, the Savannah Tribune, and the Savannah Historic Society. The work was built around a single urgent subject: the ongoing erasure of lower-income communities through gentrification by large institutions and the quiet toppling of a culture of living that those communities had sustained for generations. But to me, documentation wasn't ever the only goal. I didn't want to just record the spaces. I wanted to be able to capture the beauty of the place that I was in before it became unrecognizable. The city of Savannah has a specific relationship with light. The South's afternoon sun arrives with a heaviness, a warmth that sits in the shadows differently than anywhere else I've worked. That quality of light became central, not just to how I shot, but how I edited. And this is where we get into how I started my career editing my photos. Now, if you follow me on some of my other social media channels, predominantly Instagram, you'll know that I recently had the opportunity to become one of VSCO's ambassadors. And before I say anything else, no, this is not sponsored by VSCO. I may be one of their ambassadors, but there's a reason why I am. Every single photograph that I've ever taken that I think was worth something has been put through VSCO. I'm not joking. Every single photograph in my career has gone through VSCO. Doesn't matter if it's shot digitally or on film. And for me, the reason why is because VSCO offers film presets that most photographers don't have access to anymore. And it's also a reason why I wanted to create this video, because there's a common misunderstanding about editing in today's world, specifically about presets, because for the most part, if you're new to photography, unfortunately, you might be kind of using them as a crutch. And if you are new to photography, I implore you to understand all of the dynamics that go with editing your own photographs before you slap on a preset. But for the working photographer that's been doing this for a while, you may understand that presets are actually just the starting off point. The preset, for me, is more like the start of a conversation between my work and the image that's in front of me. And through my own personal experience, the VSCO Film X presets that are available are not just like your typical presets that you could find on any other editing service. In fact, I know it's not because I've had the chance to talk to some of the engineers. And what I've been told and shown is that they take their time to really break down and reconstruct the chemical processes of each of their film stocks that they have available. They're designed to replicate the tonal curves and the colors of original film stocks that aren't available to photographers anymore, including Fuji, Ilford, Agfa, and Kodak. Now, the science that goes behind creating these presets is a lot deeper and much more structured than your typical sort of preset that you could find on any other type of editing software. And throughout my years as a photographer editing, like I said, almost every single photograph I've ever taken on VSCO, my palette has been pretty diverse. This is a list of all the old types of film transparencies in color, black and white, and color negative. About 85% of the film stocks that were available to photographers back in the 60s and 70s are no longer with us today. VSCO has made it possible to bring some of those back to us in the modern age. For work where I want a cleaner, faster emulsion, street situations with difficult light, I reach for AV8, which is Agfa Vista 800. For scenes that call for the coolness and saturation structure of Fuji's film stocks, FP8, Fuji Pro 800Z, is foundational to my workflow. For low light work or situations where I want grain to carry real weight in the image, FS16, which is Fuji Superia 1600. But most importantly, my three big users are Kodachrome 25, Ektachrome 100, and VSCO's own preset, B1 Pro. Because lighting conditions were a crucial part of the Savannah work, I was often waiting for a quality of light to fall on a specific space, whether it be during the day or at night. The edit was built around honoring what that light was doing. The recipe I developed for that project locked in my KC25 base, the Kodachrome, a specific temperature adjustment to lean into the city's warmth, a gentle split tone, and the grain that for me is never an afterthought but a fundamental texture of how I see. New York asks entirely different questions, and it's changed me as a photographer in ways I didn't anticipate. Souls in an Urban Landscape is an ongoing book, and in the grand scape of both projects, the two bodies of work are drastically different. Where Savannah was based on geography and environment, on place as the primary subject, New York is based on human connection, or lack thereof. I want this to be a document of what it's like to live in this city during this specific time period, not an idealized version, the actual thing. What repeated exposure to the city has taught me about myself is that I'm not the romantic I was in Savannah. I've moved much further toward classicism. I'm not interested in effect. Nothing has the precision of actual life as it pertains to the subject matter of human beings, and so I've stopped chasing perfect lighting conditions in the way that I once did. In Savannah, light was a protagonist. In New York, light is a fact, and I work with what's there. And that shift has fundamentally changed the way that I edit. The New York work isn't fundamentally around a single sort of preset that I used like I did in Savannah, but more so a wide variety of them. Now, I've always been an adamant grain user. Grain doesn't bother me in the slightest. To me, it's always felt imperative that there's some sort of texture within the image. VSCO's grain tool gives me precise control over the character of that grain in ways that align with how different film stocks actually behave. What's also so interesting about the VSCO film stocks is that you can essentially push or pull like you would a normal film roll. KC25, or the Kodachrome 25, was the anchor for me in Savannah. Kodachrome's renderings of reds and yellows, its precision across the color spectrum, its relationship between warmth and clarity aligned exactly with what the city's light was giving me and what the subject matter demanded. For the New York work, I pull from across the palette depending on what the scenes require, with a consistent lean towards the cooler emulsions and the higher speed stocks that suit the city's unpredictable light. KA1, the Kodak Ektachrome E100G preset, also appears in my workflow regularly. Ektachrome's characteristics, contrast, and the way it renders blues and reds give certain New York City scenes exactly that classicist precision I'm looking for. And B1 Pro, VSCO's black and white classic preset, enters the work when color stops serving the image and structure becomes really the only thing that matters. Now, if the presets are the vocabulary, the recipes are the grammar. The reason why I use VSCO so often and why it's touched about every single one of my photographs is because you can create custom recipes that save every single aspect of the way that you edit a photograph. Everything from the emulsion type, to the brightness, to the contrast, the sharpness, the tonal curves, and your HSL sliders. This essentially lets you lock down a look so that all of your work can be cohesive. Now, whether you do this on an application like Lightroom or you use VSCO, using a recipe and creating your own presets is incredibly beneficial, especially if you're working on long-term projects. And that's because consistency in the way that you edit is what allows your project to look like a single thought or vision. Now, I wanted to bring you into what my editing workflow looks like so that you get a better understanding of what I do with just about every single one of my photographs. So today we're going to be taking from some of my recent scans developed over at Nice Film Club and go through the editing process of a few selects. Instead of taking you through every single setting that I use, because it's not really going to help you learn anything, instead I want to talk about what I tried to do when thinking about editing my photographs and how to make them more cohesive. I typically work with cooler tones as opposed to warmer tones, a preference that runs through both bodies of work despite their very different characteristics. In Savannah, where the environment naturally pushed towards warmth, I was constantly using the temperature tool to pull the edit back toward a cooler register. In New York, the cooler tendency is more native to the city's light, but the temperature and tint tools still require consistent attention. I also lean more towards a magenta hue rather than a green hue, depending on the scene. The difference between a scene that reads as cold and alienated and one that reads as clear-eyed and present is often a matter of a few degrees of temperature adjustment. For the most part, all of my basic editing is done on Lightroom. All of this is really just to get the image to a very flat sort of look that I can then go into VSCO and color correct everything that I want. After adding the selects into a folder and then bringing them over to my phone, I then open VSCO. Opening the app, I select the photographs that I want and import them into my studio. Now here's a short look at just how many filters and presets they have available. I didn't scroll through them all, but all of these Wii Pro ones are built by VSCO, and then we get into the film simulation ones. The strength is obviously how much of a preset or filter you want dictating what your photograph looks like. The character is essentially the push and pull method that you would use in the darkroom. And then warmth is obviously your temperature gauge. Below are all the recipes that you've created that you can save and then reapply to any of your photographs, like I was talking about before. For this image, I selected one of my presets that I've made using the Ektachrome 100. For this next one, I want to show off how you can add favorites to every single one of your presets that you like using. So I cleared out mine, and these are all of the presets that I use on a day-to-day basis when editing my photographs. For this photograph, we've chosen Kodak Kodachrome 25, the main filter preset that I used when shooting in Savannah, Georgia. And that's because I knew that this scene needed a little bit more blues after I got the scans back. Usually the first thing that I touch getting into VSCO is the exposure and contrast levels and trying to balance those out. Here, you can see some of the effects things that VSCO has to offer, like grain, scratches, glows, lights, bokeh, 35mm frames, if you're into that sort of thing. I'm not, but
If you are, I've never been in opposition to grain, so I usually always add just a little bit more grain to my photos regardless if it's already grainy after development. I almost never touch the global saturation slider. It's like a blunt instrument. It raises or lowers the intensity of every color in the frame simultaneously, which almost always produces results that either feel garish or flat. Instead, I work entirely through the HSL sliders, manipulating each color channel individually, the hue, saturation, and luminance of each specific color in the image. I wanted to save this specific look, so I opened the recipes bar and then clicked the plus sign, and now throughout any photograph that I want to edit, this becomes readily available using all of the same edits and adjustments that I made to this image. Here's a look at all of my recipes that I've created on the same image. So we're going to use that same Kodachrome and apply it to this image. Now, here's what I'm talking about as the preset as the starting point. These images are different in nature, in lighting, and in subject matter, and I know that I want the overall feel of it to feel cohesive with the last one since they were taken on the same day, but the overall adjustments I made to the prior image just don't match the one that I'm looking at now. So I go back through and make minor adjustments to each aspect of the photograph. This approach is especially critical in the New York work, where human subjects, people in a diverse city, photographed in a range of lighting conditions are the primary subject matter. Getting skin tones right across a range of complexions in a single frame requires granular control. I use the skin tone tool in coordination with direct HSL manipulation of the yellow, blue, red, and orange channels, and this allows me to nail skin tones for portraits and for full scenes within a diverse crowd, ensuring that the edit serves every person in the frame, not just the person the meter happened to expose for. The thing that I've noticed is that the finer the adjustment, usually the better, and so a way that I combat this is by taking the sliders to the extremes, pushing the sliders as far left and as far right as possible, and then gradually making my way back down to the center until I find something that works. And here is VSCO's dodge and burn techniques, the same technique that I talked about earlier. Here, I just felt as if some of the shadows that were in the painting that this person had made were getting lost in the blue tones. So I went through and burned the parts that I felt like needed to have a little bit more depth to them.
A single photograph can be extraordinary, but a body of work says something entirely different. It's an argument, a sustained cumulative presence that you were there long enough to create something meaningful. Where people go wrong, though, is that they think that cohesion means that every single photograph has to match something else within the body of work. It's not about making every single image look the same, but rather ensuring that every image speaks the same language. Two photographs can be entirely different in subject matter, in light, and composition, but due to editing, can feel as if they're a part of the same thought. The inverse can be true as well. Two photographs can be identical in composition or lighting or subject matter and feel entirely different because of the way that it was edited. The edit is where your own visual identity and language preserves itself throughout the entirety of your work. It's where a collection of exposures made across days or weeks or years in different conditions under different circumstances get unified into something that holds together. This is why a lot of great photographers are also great editors, or they trust an editor to make the correct decisions on their own personal vision. Over time, every photographer that sticks with this ends up developing an editing style that's just as unique as their shooting style. And it's created through thousands of photographs being edited, discussing things like tone, color, hues, and mood. And it's learned through failure and looking at your own work and the work of others. Fred Herzog's Modern Color was formative for me not because I wanted to replicate his images, but because he demonstrated that color in photography is not merely a decoration. The way you render color tells the viewer what you believe about the scene in front of you. KC25 and the Kodachrome rendering that VSCO's preserved in that preset embodies a precision, a richness that aligned with what I believed about Savannah, that these places were beautiful and that they deserved to be rendered with the same fidelity as any historically celebrated subject. As I said at the start of this video, the image that you create and the image that you show the world are entirely different. And that distance between them is craft. The photographers who've always understood this, from Gustave Le Gray combining negatives in the 1850s, to Ansel Adams burning skies in his darkroom, to Fred Herzog building a color philosophy in the streets of Vancouver, were not manipulators in the pejorative sense. They were editors. They were making arguments about what their images should mean. That's what editing is. It's not a technical step that follows a creative act. It is the creative act that's expanded into a specific vision. The camera captures the moment, but the edit decides what that moment means, what it feels like to be in the frame. In 2026, with the tools available inside VSCO and the depth of color science the platform is built around the legacy of analog film, there's never been a more precise or powerful set of instruments for that work. So whether you shoot on digital or shoot analog, the darkroom is never closed. It's just moved into your pocket. That's going to be it for today's video, guys. But before I do my regular sign off, I'd love to be able to talk to you about the workshop that I'm going to be teaching here in New York City this Saturday, May 2nd at 1 to 3 p.m. at the Photodome Studios here in Brooklyn. Everything that we discussed in this video today, we're going to be discussing more in depth in an in-person workshop where I'm going to be taking you through my own editing sequences and how to develop your own visual language through your own editing sequences. Everybody that joins is going to get a free trial of VSCO Pro, where you'll be able to play with every single one of the aspects that I talked about within this video. You can RSVP here. I really want to be able to open the conversation up and talk about your work and what your vision is as an artist and photographer, and help you understand the ways that I've edited my photos to create a cohesive body of work, and how you can do the same with your own visual language. I'll be putting up an RSVP link on my Instagram as well as this comes out, so that you can RSVP there as well. And I honestly hope to see you there, because I think that it's going to be a really great educational workshop. You can also find a coordinating article post on Substack with this video at The Creative Connection. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and like I just said, Substack. And really, that's going to be it for today. There's nothing else to really do except get out there and get shooting, come back home and edit with intention, and keep moving forward. I'll catch you on the next one.